I'm Paul Kamen. If you don't know me well, I'll give a brief resume. I started sailing in 1956 when I was 5. Best known on the Bay probably for winning the Merit 25 local class championships a number of times. And when we weren't in one design class anymore, the YRA division in that level. I navigated 17 Hawaii races, won my division twice. Navigated boats as big as 82 feet, and just done a lot of sailing on big boats and small boats, and do pretty good locally. So, diving right in, we'll take example 1. Starting line. Mark is this way. I mean, the starting line is too big from that to the course, so let's say the mark is up there somewhere. Wind is coming like this. Which end of the line would you start on?
Right.
How many people say this end closer to the mark? 1, 2, 3. How many say this end closer to the wind? Okay. Why do you think it's the end closer to the wind?
Well, it's favorable in terms of pointing. Where's the mark? Sorry.
Mark is in that direction.
Oh, in that direction.
It's a fetch either way.
Okay, I know. Okay. No, I
You
changed
change
my
your
answer. Yeah.
Okay, well, why do you think it's faster to start at this end then? Okay, anybody?
It's closer to the mark.
Well, does that mean you're going to get there faster?
No, not necessarily.
You're going to be in a
Okay, let's do the vote again.
Okay.
Wind's coming slightly from that side.
Okay.
Mark is more in that direction. How many think this is faster to start here? 1. How many think this is faster?
Yeah, I could.
Okay, good.
It's better over there. Yeah.
Can you go close haul from the left end and make the mark?
Sure, because you're going to be going, well, okay, let's take the simpler case. Where'd the eraser go?
Do you have, did you take the first?
Let's say the wind is right angles to the line. Which end is better to start at?
Can you go close haul from the left end and fetch the mark?
No, this is the direction to the mark, and it's distant. So you're not going to fetch the mark on either tack. So how many think there's an advantage to starting here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How many think there's an advantage to starting here? How many think it doesn't make any difference? Well, the answer is it doesn't make any difference, all other things being equal.
Or about you get clear air.
Because the boat that starts here on port tack, the boat that starts here on starboard tack, get to the same point at the same time. A boat that goes starboard tack here, eventually is going to have to tack back, and they'll get to the same point at the same time if their speeds are equal. I'm also assuming the same number of tacks to get to the windward mark. All this to make the point that as long as the first leg is a beat, that is, as long as you have to tack even once to get to the windward mark, the favored end of the line to start at is the end that's furthest upwind. So just a little bit of wind shift to that side, or the line being a little bit skewed to the wind, means that the upwind end of the line is favored. Because the boat starting here will go something like that, the boat starting here will go like this, and this boat crosses ahead of that boat at their first crossing. And even if they don't do a first crossing there, if the first crossing happens 15 minutes up the course, it's going to be the same thing when they cross. So, is there anyone not clear on the geometry, how that works? No one will admit it anyway.
So it really doesn't matter where the upwind mark is in that sense.
As long as you have to tack to get to the upwind mark, or as long as there are no other strong strategic considerations about which side of the course you want to be on, then the upwind side is always better. Now, how do you tell which end of the line is furthest upwind? Who has a procedure they use?
Test it.
You can shoot the line.
How do you test it?
Point boat?
Point the boat like off the end of the buoy and sight down the line.
I think that's pretty much it. There are various ways you can use a compass to do that too, but what I like to do is just luff up into the wind so the boat is still drifting forward when it comes right abeam of the mark, and usually there's a traveler or some horizontal reference on the boat, and by sighting in exactly that direction, if you're sighting exactly parallel to the line, then the line is square. If you find that when you luff into the wind, you're going a little bit this way, then which end is favored? Everybody agree?
Right side.
Right.
Anybody disagree? Well, good, this is the right side. If you luff into the wind and you're going a little bit like this, then which end is favored?
Left side.
Now, another interesting phenomena happens when you have a crowded start. Lots of boats. All the boats getting a good start. The wind will sort of see this as an obstacle, and the wind will flow around it a little bit like this. So whichever end you start at, if you've measured your close hauled sailing course before, and then you measure your close hauled sailing course when you actually cross the starting line, you'll typically find a little bit of a lift at this leeward end, and a little bit of a header at the windward end. So actually, the wind being completely square on a crowded start, there's a very slight advantage to being there if your start is perfect and if the other boats don't keep you from tacking. On the other hand, if you start here, even though you're headed a little bit, you're free to tack and do whatever strategical plan you want to implement.
Paul,
Yeah.
when you shoot the wind, I usually shoot it to see which line is favored, I usually shoot it from the middle of the line, not from the pin end.
I think that's more difficult, because when you're in the middle of the line, it's really hard to tell whether you're over or under. And you might be a little over the line and look like that and think, this end must be favored. But you don't have that precision to be right on the line when you're shooting from the middle. It helps if you have shore bearings, which I'm getting to next. So pre-start data. 1, what we just did, favored end. 2, shore bearings. Who can tell me what shore bearings are? Why they're important for start?
This is something that you can line up with one of the pins to figure out exactly where the line is when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, it's a way of solving that problem of am I over or under when you're in the middle of the line. Let's say the line is like this. There's a shoreline like this. There's another distant shoreline over there. If you're in the middle of the line, unless you have eyes in the back of your head, it's impossible to tell by looking one way and then the other way if you're really on the line, exactly on the line that goes right between those 2 points. I've fantasized about having a little periscope that looks backwards so I could hold this gadget up and look at the line and see the reflection 180 degrees back that way, and then you can instantly tell if you are over or under. But no one's built a device like that since I made one out of cardboard when I was 12, but I never took it sailing. So the idea of the shore bearing, you pass the ascension of the line. What you see when you look this way will be a big buoy, a small buoy, let's see, there's the horizon, and hopefully there's a church steeple conveniently located right at the horizon. That way, when you're in the middle of the line, if you see this, what does it mean? You're below the line or above the line? Below. And if you see this, you're above the line. And of course, if you see this, you're right on the line. And it's good to have shore bearings in both directions. So 2 directions. So that's actually 2 pieces of data you need as part of this bit of information number 2. 3 is time to run line. Conceptually, this is the easy one. You have a starting line, you just sail along on a beam reach with, trim for speed, see how long it takes, then go the other way, see how long it takes. some of the older books about sailing, and I could point out here that I learned to race from a book by Arthur Knapp, which was first published in the 30s and reissued in the 50s, and I started racing in the 60s, and Arthur Knapp's book was still widely used and one of the more comprehensive books out there. He actually recommends timing one way and timing the other way, and whichever direction is going slower probably means that the wind was more behind you. So the slower direction the faster direction is going away from the favored end. Assuming that the boat goes faster as it's going further downwind. With more modern boats, especially with multi-hulls and windsurfers, that might not be true, and especially in light air. The faster direction might be more into the wind. So you can't use timing the line anymore as a way to judge which end is favored. Sometimes you can use sail trim. Set the sails perfectly for one direction, come around and go the other direction, and if the sails are a little bit too far out, then you know the wind was going more from the direction you're going with the sails luffing. Or if the sails are too far in, then you know the other side was probably the upwind side. But shooting into the wind and luffing and getting the boom blowing exactly over the middle of the boat and sighting perpendicular to the boat is I think the most accurate way to do this. So the reason for doing the timed line is to help with your judgment when you're approaching the line. If you know it takes 45 seconds to run the line, and you're here and you have 45 seconds left, and it looks like this distance is a little bit, from the way I drew it, it looks like the distance is about the same, then you know you're about right for getting there. What else do we have in pre-race data? Close haul course. Nobody can read that. That's tough. I can't write anymore. It's all keyboard. So if you're approaching a starting line, usually a good tactic is to approach a little bit early and a little bit low, so that you can come up a little bit to lose speed and come down a little bit to get speed back. And there's a little bit of jockeying with other boats and defending your right, forcing out boats that are to windward. But if you get below that course, that's the close hold course, then suddenly you're buried. You can't accelerate back to that point on the line that you want to start. The point in the line you want to start might be here or anywhere, but if you know the close hold course and you get below it, you're not going to be able to get back to it without losing a lot of speed. By the same token, if you're coming in this way, if you're barging, and you see that you're 10 or 20 degrees below the close hold course, then another boat can come up or come up here and force you out on the wrong side of the mark. So the compass heading of the close hold course is very important. On a small boat without a compass, then distant landmark, like left side of the Bay Bridge typically, or one of the container cranes in the Oakland Outer Harbor. But be careful using the container cranes as a shore reference, because they move. Questions about any of this? What's next on my list? Okay, we did shore bearings, we did slow tax to check the wind. My favorite starting line puzzler. Let's get to the starting line. How does this work again? This is an anchored committee boat. And the anchored committee boat sees the wind direction coming slightly like this. Race committees very often like to set the line slightly favoring the left end, because they're less likely to get hit that way if you start away from them. So that's two reasons why, all other things being equal, this leeward end start usually works better than a windward end start. It's a little more difficult to time accurately because you don't see the mark. Because you have to cross in front of it instead of passing it. But it's generally less crowded at the leeward end. you get a little bit of lift from that big fleet blocking the wind and causing that extra lift that you can only see right at the start. And committees like to favor that end so boats don't crash into it.
But on the other hand, you're more likely to end up in bad air if you don't end up ahead of the fleet, or not?
Well, there's a little more burden to get a good start, because if you're back a row, it's going to be difficult to tack away. If you start in bad air here, you can escape. If you start in bad air here, you're pretty much stuck. So you have to be good at getting the timing right. Now let's say there's current going this way at maybe 1.5 knots, and you have a boat that sails 4.5 knots. That means when you luff into the wind, you're going to see wind direction from here, because the current is going that way. But the committee boat is anchored. Actually, the committee boat would be like this, wouldn't it, if they're anchored in that direction. But the committee boat sees the current like that, so they set the line favoring this end. Which end is the better end to start at? Ooh, I stumped everybody. Okay, we have one vote for left, another vote for
It's
left.
still the left. Yeah, left too.
Does it matter where the mark is?
No, you can't fetch the mark either way. Now, it's true that if it was a very strong current, you might be able to fetch a mark up there because the current's, you can think of the current as the mark moving through the water in that direction the whole time. But let's assume you can't fetch the mark. Okay, so very good. You all agree that it's the left end.
No, I said the right end.
Oh, you said right end. Oh, well, why do you think it's the right end?
Well, I think it should be the apparent wind of your boat that's mattering. I mean, this is like this problem when you're sailing down a river with the current, whether it's better to have a 5-mile-an-hour wind in the direction of the current or to go on a calm day. And you actually want to go on a calm day because then you have wind.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if the explanation made sense, but you're right. You go with the wind over the water, not with the wind over the bottom, because you're sailing in the water. And again, a boat that starts over here this is the wind direction over the water right here. A boat that starts here will go like that. A boat that starts here will see that same wind direction like that. Even though the people on the committee will go, why is everybody starting at this end? We favored the other end. Anyway, that doesn't come up very often. Usually our tides in the bay go upwind, downwind instead of crosswind. But it's a good little test. Last thing on starting lines is the Vanderbilt formula. This also comes from Arthur Knapp's book, because he sailed with Harold Vanderbilt and some America's Cup defenders. What that is you cross the starting line at the place you want to start. To make it simple, let's say it's near the right end. You see how much time is left when the stern of the boat crosses the line. Actually, I should draw the line like that. Let's say it takes 10 seconds for the boat to do a broad reach to close reach tack, which is the number I use for the Mare 25. So here to here is 10 seconds. You cross the line going the wrong way with 60 seconds left. What time should you begin your tack back for the line? And let's assume you're going to go the same speed both ways, which is pretty much true for bay conditions for a boat like a Mare 25.
25.
Okay. So we have one vote for 25 seconds,
20 seconds.
20 seconds.
How much time is left to the start?
60 seconds over here.
Right. And it takes
Here to
10.
here is 10 seconds.
Right. So it's 25, I would guess.
Clearly
Yeah.
25.
Yeah, 25 is the right answer, although Arthur Knapp says that he has trouble convincing people that you subtract half the tacking time instead of the whole tacking time. So the algorithm is, if this is T1, the time to tack, which we'll call T2, equals T1 over 2 minus tacking time over 2. So what you have to be able to do fast in your head, see how much time is left. Let's say it's 54 seconds when the stern of your boat crosses the line going the wrong way. What's half of that?
22.
27.
No,
And
but
then
you gotta
half
subtract.
the tacking time, so you get 22 seconds.
Right.
Now, it's easy to do that sitting in the classroom. You'd be surprised how hard it is to do that simple calculation when you're trying to steer the boat and avoid all the traffic around you and yell at your crew to trim the sails better and all the stuff you have to do when you're skippering a small boat. But that's the modified Vanderbilt formula. I don't know what the original Vanderbilt formula was, but that's what Arthur Knapp calls it. He also has some great advice about junior programs, by the way. There's a whole chapter which consists of only one sentence, and he says there are only 3 things you have to know about a junior program. Start him young, treat him rough, and tell him nothing. And that's how they ran junior programs in the 1930s. Okay, next topic is upwind leg and wind shifts. So you started down here somewhere. The wind field is flowing like this. Halfway up the course, the wind shifts like this. And let's say wind mark here, starting line down there. Does it make any difference which side of the course you go to? How many say no? How many say yes? Okay, so the people who say yes, which side should you sail to?
Right.
Right.
Okay, that's pretty clear to everybody, I guess. You can zigzag as much as you want, and the time required to get to any point on this line is theoretically equal. Because your crosswind repositioning is free when you're going upwind. Again, neglecting the time you actually lose by the tacks. But to get to this mark, would you rather start from here or from here? Well, with a wind shift this big, you can practically fetch the mark from there, but from here, the mark is still directly upwind. The moral there being, if you expect to shift, you want to tack to the side of the course that's on the side the wind is shifting to. We can generalize that a little more. And more often than sudden wind shifts like that, what we have in the bay very often is a curving wind field. This might happen because there's a point of land here. It's very prominent around Angel Island, where this is Point Blunt. And you might be racing from the middle of the Olympic Circle area up to Yellow Bluff and the Marine Shoreline. Or, I mean, it even happens around his lordships in a short race if the mark was outside his lordships. So in a curving wind field, which side do you want to tack to? Yeah. Rule of thumb, always tack to the inside of curving wind field. Especially if the curvature is exaggerated right at the point. As you come up to the point, you get lifted. I'll draw the point here so you don't have to sail right through it. As you sail away from the point, you're lifted on the other side. That's more important for ocean racing, where the wind field is relatively steady offshore, but every few miles there's a projecting point of land, and if you time your tacks to go right in towards those points, like Año Nuevo or Pillar Point or Matara Point or any of the other points up and down the coast, you can make a big gain over both the staying outside and steady wind field. Other reasons too, like there might be more contrary current if you're further out. Except don't try it on Point Matara, because that's usually a calm spot for other reasons. Any questions about that? Is that not intuitively obvious to everybody?
Which was the favorite side again?
Always tack to the inside of bending wind.
Inside, okay.
So, starting line, first mark, wind field bending like that, always go that way.
Yes.
And you can work it out with graph paper and little do sort of a piecewise simulation. But it's not hard to convince yourself that that's the better path. What about downwind? Same thing. We have curving wind field, windward mark, finish line. Which side? Okay, if it's the inside upwind, it must be the outside downwind, right? Well, it turns out you still want to sail to the inside of the curving wind, because downwind, there's usually an advantage to sailing in headed air instead of lifted air.
Mhm.
So let's make this more extreme. Again, assuming it's the kind of boat which goes a little bit faster on a reach than a dead run, which is true of all boats, even the dinghies will benefit from this. So by going to this side, you're lifted, so you're on a faster tack. When you come back to the finish line, you're also, I mean, excuse me, this is the average wind direction. It's average, that's bent. This is average, that's bent. So you can see that you're headed slightly, so you're sailing a hotter course than if you were out here away from the wind bend. So same rule still applies. Always jibe towards the inside of a curving wind field. And by the same token, if you expect the wind to shift in the middle of that downwind leg, then you want to take, and you have a choice of which jibe to be on here. You want to take the jibe that gets you on the inside of that new shift. When you're going upwind, you're looking for a shift that's a header so that you can tack on it and it becomes a lift. When you're going downwind, you're looking for a shift that's a lift so that you can jibe on it. Is that too confusing the way it's stated? You'll figure it out later if you don't get it now. Well, you're soaking it all up. This is going fast. So we did bending wind upwind, bending wind downwind, covering. You're sailing along close haul. Actually, I wanted to make this, just to keep it simple, I wanted to make this a 45-degree angle to the wind. So let's draw the center line of the boat there. And there's another boat exactly downwind in a parallel course like this. Now, even though you're exactly upwind of that boat, the important concept here is that the apparent wind doesn't follow the true wind. The true wind is 10 knots, like this, and you're moving forward at 3 knots, like that. Quick little vector diagram, 10 knots, 3 knots. You get an apparent wind of, what, about 12 at an angle more like, let's try and draw a masthead fly here. The masthead fly is something like that. Maybe a typical apparent wind angle going upwind is 30 degrees, not 40 degrees, even if you're sailing 45 degrees off the wind. So what happens to the wind shadow? Does the wind shadow follow the true wind or the apparent wind?
Oh, the apparent.
Yeah, well, the wind shadow, all the wind shadow knows is how the boat is moving through the air. The wind shadow, the wind doesn't know anything about where the water is or how the water's moving or how the boat's moving through the water. The only thing that affects the wind is how the boat is moving through the air. So the wind shadow is going to go like this through the apparent wind. And this boat is actually in clear air, even though it's dead downwind. Things get a little more complicated when boats get very close, because the fact that this sail is generating lift means there's a pressure gradient here, lower pressure here, higher pressure here. As the air approaches the sail, it will start to bend a little bit like that and cause a little bit of lift. And that actually persists for some distance around the boat. So a boat sailing here is in what's called the safe leeward. This boat actually has a slight speed advantage by this boat being here and causing the air to lift maybe only a degree, maybe only a fraction of a degree, but it's very real. And if you get into this safe leeward position on another boat, it's very easy to hold that position, and it's very easy to start pointing just a little bit higher until you're giving this boat dead air. But the main point is, wind shadow follows apparent wind. So when you're covering another boat, you really want to be almost right ahead of that boat, so that the apparent wind is right on them, so that they can't possibly get clear air and can't possibly go as fast as you're going. The trouble is when both boats tack, then your wind shadow goes back like that, so then you'll have clear air again. The trick there is to anticipate when the other boat's going to tack. If you have the other boat right in your backwind like that, and you're getting towards the side of the course near the ley line, or for some other reason you think the boat's going to tack soon, well, it probably should tack soon just to get out of your bad air. You need to start working up and getting back into that directly upwind position, or even here. And it's not hard to do that because this boat's going really slow. It's right in your gas like that. You really want to get back into this position so that when this boat tacks, you're back in this actual hard covering position, getting your backwind right at them.
Can you, I'm sorry, maybe
Yeah.
slow down a little bit?
Oh,
Like,
sure.
Can you just draw two boats? And like, which is the worst place to be when you're the boat behind? Maybe,
Worst place to be is right in the apparent wind, like that. If you can see that boat's masthead fly and you're looking right at it, then you're the worst possible place.
the wind is coming from the top.
Wind is
Right.
coming from, true wind is from here,
Right,
but apparent wind will be from here.
right, okay. Because I've seen some other diagrams where I thought the worst place was a little bit to the right of where you drew the boat behind, but that's not correct then?
Well, a lot of it depends on how fast the boats are.
Okay.
If the boats are slow and the wind is strong, then the apparent wind isn't distorted so much. Yeah.
There are some diagrams that say that there's bad air being whooshed off the mainsail that would be, this bad air shadow would be to the port and back of the
Oh yeah, the air right behind is pretty bad also.
But even upwind of that a little bit.
Yeah.
How significant is that? How bad is that bad air?
Well, if you made a contour plot of how bad it was, the deep hole would be here, and then it would get increasingly better as you go out like that.
Just
You
like
put
that.
something like this.
Yeah, okay.
Markeye has a book called Sailing Theory and Practice, published in the mid-60s, I think. And he actually draws this contour plot. He did it with wind tunnel tests of 5.5 meters, I think, and had one model rig in the wind tunnel and moved the other rig all around to get these contours of available wind energy, a combination of altered wind speed and altered wind direction. And it's worth digging that up. If I had thought of it, that would have been a good thing to copy and distribute. And if somebody reminds me in email, I'll do that and put it on the web.
Is there a rule of thumb that's how many boat lengths
Yeah.
that's affected, or
Uh,
how fast it degrades?
There are lots of rules of thumb. Take the largest one. I've read 10 to 12 mast lengths. So on the Bahias, how tall is the mast? About 20 feet. So that means 200 to 240 feet back for it to make a difference. But you know, it's asymptotic. There's no sharp cutoff. The further away you get, the less effect it has. But anything closer than 10 mast lengths, and you start thinking seriously about tacking to get out of there. Because
Well,
of the
but also the way you do the contours implies even like there's like a lot like a linear decay. Is it really a linear decay? Is it more like an exponential decay or a logarithmic decay?
I doubt that it's strictly exponential, but it is asymptotic.
Okay.
And when you look at Markey's plot, you know, I'm just making wild guesses at how those contours would go. But one of the reasons for this position being bad, especially when you're close, is because the flow around your sails starts to give this boat a slight lift. So you really have to analyze it as the two rigs together and how the wind flows over both of them combined to get the relative advantage or disadvantage. Some tricks for braking cover. If you're the boat behind, well, the favorite always is a fake tack, but they're usually ready for it the first time. You know, let's say you're sailing along, a boat that's ahead of you comes and plants a tack right over you. They half expect you to tack as soon as they do that. In fact, they should expect you to tack away. And of course, if you tack, And they're more worried about beating you than beating anyone else, then they'll tack and cover, and you're still covered. Typically, people will try to fake tack the next time. You know, you yell ready about, you start to turn, you wait to see if they turn, and then you go back that way. But that hardly ever works on the second time. The time to do the fake tack is on the first tack, because they're not ready for that fake tack on the first time. And you know, it takes a little bit of conspiratorial planning with your crew, especially at the sailing club, where you might have a new crew for each race. You need to agree in advance what your signals are for the fake tack. One of the stories, and it might have been in another book, I think it was in Arthur Knapp's book, about the 1958 America's Cup defense. This was during the selection trials, but the tactician of the other boat realized that Bob Bevere, who was skippering the boat that Arthur Knapp was involved in, would normally hold the wheel like this and do a kind of a light touch tack. But when he was doing a fake tack, he would put his hands right on top of the wheel. And they went through the whole selection series before they let Bob Bevere know that that's how they were spotting his fake tacks. So knowing your competition is valuable here. Where are we? Breaking cover, using an obstruction to break cover. The other favorite way to break cover, which actually works much more reliably than the fake tack, wait for another boat to come along. And just when this other boat is about over here or over here, in some other position that'll make it undesirable for them to tack, that's when you tack. And if they've already committed to crossing astern, then they can't tack to cover you. Or if they do tack, they'll usually lose some speed on the tack, and they'll be in bad air even worse than you. Or if there's a restricted starting line, for example. This happens a lot in the midwinter races out of Berkeley, where the windward leg goes from below the starting line to above the starting line. The starting line itself is restricted. If they're covering you like that, wait until they're past the ley line for this end of the restricted line. Then tack. And if they tack, they're going to have to go down and lose distance to get around. More likely, they'll keep going to the other side. So use the environment around you to help break a cover if you need to.
So what's a restricted start?
It's a restricted starting line. They use the same line for start and finish, and it's in the middle of the windward leg because it's a twice or three times around course. So the sailing instructions for that particular series say you can't sail through the start-finish line unless you're starting or finishing, because it would be very confusing for the race committee. They wouldn't know if you were finishing or if you were just on the second windward leg.
Now, Paul, when you're covering somebody, does that mean you're going to stop covering them pretty soon because you're going faster?
Not if that's the boat you really want to beat in the series, or if you're first and they're second.
You're just holding them down.
Yeah, well, they'll get further and further behind. But even if they're those 10 or 12 bass lengths behind, you can still tack on their wind. And also, covering them as the distance increases isn't a matter of giving them bad air anymore. It's a matter of making sure you go the same place they go, so they don't find a favorable wind shift that you don't get. And if they can sail faster, then they're still not going to pass you because because as they get closer, they get into your bad air again. Yet another reason why the good start is so important. If you start out covering a boat that's faster than you, then it's going to be real hard for them to get by, at least on the windward leg.
So is that the classic mistake Dennis Kamen made in race 5 with the America's Cup?
Well, he says that he did cover. And I'm not sure how true that is. I got to trim main sheet for him for a week in 1981 in Big Boat Series, and he was, we saw him later in 1984, right after he lost the America's Cup. I was on the same boat, race to Mexico. He was on a different boat then, and some of our crew were taunting him about not covering, and his response was, "I did cover." So you can interpret that any way you want, but he knew he didn't have the speed, And I think he knew the only way to save the series was to go to the side of the course that he was pretty sure was faster, but it wasn't faster by enough. He did very well in that Mexico race. The boat I navigated didn't do so well, and he practically dragged me out of the boat, dragged me to his boat, and sat me down at his chart table and showed me a satellite photo that he had paid a lot of money for, showing El Nino and showing where the contrary currents were, and said, "Why didn't you have one of these?" So another lesson learned: if there's information available, you need it. Don't turn your back on any weather or tactical or what would have been illegal information to get during the race, but it was perfectly legal to get that chart before the race. Yeah.
A situation that happens often in the club is when you're headed towards the downwind mark. People are usually on a full run, wing on wing. What's the best strategy for the boat behind? So you're behind somebody else's boat. You may be blocking their wind. I'm not sure, but like I find myself in that situation a lot, and I'm not sure what to do.
Well, the wind still follows the apparent wind. I mean, the wind shadow still follows the apparent wind. So if the true wind is like that, and you're moving this way reasonably fast, your apparent wind will be like this. Your wind shadow is going like this. And if it's a boat big enough to have a masthead wind indicator, it'll be an arrow like that pointing into the wind. So you want to position your wind shadow so that it hits the boat you're attacking.
So it's not dead behind them then.
Well, if you're reaching up like this, it won't be.
No, let's say you're in a full run,
Yeah,
doing wing on wing.
with smaller and slower boats, then sometimes the best course is dead downwind because it allows the jib to wing out, as you say. Then yes, exactly behind the other boat, so the wind shadow goes down that way.
So technically you're going to catch them, right, in this position.
Well, you might be locked into their wave train a little bit, so they might be. You've got a little more pressure in your sails because you're giving them some bad air, but they're making a wave train that looks something like this. And if you're locked into their waves, it's very difficult to cross a wave crest and get another wavelength closer to them. That's more true with heavier boats than with light boats, but it is real. And at certain distances, you're not giving them enough wind shadow to gain, and you're in their wave train, so you're kind of locked to go at the same speed that they go. And there, sometimes the best move is to move way out to one side to get out of their wave train. That comes later in my syllabus here. The boundaries of this wave system make an angle with the center line of 19¼ degrees. It seems like a funny arbitrary number, but there are various ways of proving it. Starting from a point about 1 waterline length ahead of the boat, you can draw this triangle, 19¼ degrees, or maybe it's 19½ degrees, I forget. It doesn't work out to exactly that. Something like 19 degrees, 27 minutes, or whatever it is. And there's no wave action outside of that triangle. It's called the Kelvin wave system. There's a simplified sort of hokey proof that I tried to write up one time, but that's left as an exercise for the students. Yeah.
So let's say you managed to catch up to them. Let's say the wave effect was not that great, and
Yeah.
you're giving them bad air, so you catch up to them. Now, what do you do
Then what do you do?
when you catch up to them? Yeah. What tactic?
Well, one more point about how you give them bad air. If they're on the other jibe, remember that the wind shadow is going from your sails. You would want to be over here, so that your sail casts its wind shadow on their sail.
Mm.
So keep that in mind when you're attacking boat on the other side. Well, the way I've shown it now, you're on port and they're on starboard, so you can't do that much. It's good if they're on port and you come up on starboard, then here's where the racing rules are different from the international rules. You can go starboard and sail right into their transom, and they're wrong. So they have to get out of your way as you come up. If it's the same tack thing, you have to think ahead to the next mark. Let's say both boats are on starboard. Up here. If you establish an overlap to leeward like that, they're not allowed to sail below their proper course. They can force you below your proper course. This is a point of rules that people often get wrong. The leeward boat says you can't force me below my proper course, which is not true. The proper course limitation only applies to the windward boat. But this isn't a racing rules lecture. That was last week. So tactically, if you think you're faster, and if the wind's really right dead down, you can move out to the side like that and eventually go by them. If you pass them on the windward side, then of course you're vulnerable to being luffed up. And luffing up is the defensive maneuver that boat being passed can take, and it slows both boats down. It depends on where other boats are in the race, or how badly they want to keep you from passing, or how badly you want to beat them. So in a true dead down situation, passing on the leeward side is going to be safer. But it's usually not a true dead down situation. Usually the wind is favoring one tack, and that's why the booms are both on this side. So there's going to be more bad air trying to get clear of them over there than there would be on this side. But in the races we have at the sailing club, usually by the time any of that can play out all the way, you're at the next mark. So the direction around the next mark has a huge effect on which side you want to be on. Obviously, if you can get an overlap on the inside, go around the mark ahead of them, and that's usually what the priority is when you're passing a boat on a run like that. Yeah.
One other question. So, same situation, you're headed down to the downwind mark. On our kinds of boats, is it better to go wing on wing and go on a full run, or is it better to be driving on a broad reach?
I haven't sailed the Bahias to know. On the Lido 14s, they were heavier and slower, and a dead run was really just as good as reaching up a little bit, except in very, very light air. You know, like 3 knots or less. And then the boat would feel completely dead if it was drifting at 1.5 knots downwind and 3 knots of wind. There's only 1.5 knots in the sail, but if you came up a little bit, you would get enough extra speed to make the boat feel a little more lively.
So the higher the wind, the more you want to jive?
No, the higher the wind, the more you want to go dead down.
Okay.
So are we up to how to use the polar curve of the boat yet? I want to make sure I'm not leaving anything out here. Okay, so how many of you have some familiarity with polar performance curves of sailboats? Have looked at them? And, it's only called a polar curve because it's plotted in polar coordinates, where for every angle there's a quantity. Sailing dead upwind, the speed is 0, so it starts here. Sailing at a 45-degree angle, this represents the close haul speed. This would be the beam reach speed, this would be the broad reach speed, and then if the wind speed is such that the dead run speed is a little bit slower, the polar curve might look something like this. And of course it's symmetrical on the other side. So the interesting thing here is that wherever the curve is concave, even if it's a non-continuous, I hesitate to use the word non-differentiable curve, concave, alternating courses is desirable. Like here, obviously, there's a huge bucket in the polar curve going upwind, so you alternate, tacking this way and this way and this way and this way, and the upwind speed equals this distance.
Paul, I'm not really following it. What does the polar curve measure or indicate?
This is the angle from the true wind. If it's along this line, it's a 90-degree angle from the true wind. If it's this way, it's going dead downwind. that is this way is 45 degrees upwind. The distance of the points on this curve from the center represent the speed you can sail on that angle. So what a curve of this shape shows, but maybe we can put some real numbers.
What are the axes and what do they, so you have a horizontal and a vertical axis there?
Well, no, it's polar. The two axes are the radius and the angle.
Okay.
So the angle represents the angle from the true wind.
Mhm.
The radius represents the speed the boat can sail.
Okay.
So at a 45-degree angle, you can sail, let's say 3 knots. At a 90-degree angle, you can sail 4 knots. On a broad reach, maybe 4.5. And then on a run, maybe it's down to 3.5, which might be typical, say, maybe a Merrick 25 and 8 knots of wind would have a
So
characteristic
each
like
boat
that.
design has one of these curves?
Yeah, for each wind speed, it's different.
Right,
This would be the 8-knot wind speed.
correct. And so technically, there's one of these for the Bahia and one for the J1.
Yeah, it may never have been published. You can, with some instruments, you can build one yourself.
Senior project for
Yeah,
someone.
well, you can just, you measure the wind direction. If the wind is steady, measure the wind direction with the boat stationary, and measure the wind speed with the boat stationary, and then reference it to a compass course, and then sail various compass courses and use a GPS to get the speed of various courses. And you could come up with a reasonably useful polar curve without too much trouble, assuming there's no current and
Right.
your GPS ground speeds represent the water.
Now,
speed.
once you have it, let's say you magically get it. Now that I understand what it is, like, what do you do with it again?
Well, on a big boat with very carefully calibrated instruments, you might see 8 knots of wind. Okay, then I know my maximum speed made good downwind is going to be at that angle. It's going to be like.
Oh, I see. These are BMGs. These are not absolute
Well, no,
speed.
the VMG is the vertical component of this
Right.
speed.
Right, but the number that you're drawing there, like 4.5, is
No.
that BMG or is that?
It's just boat speed through the water.
Okay.
But this times the cosine of that angle would be the VMG,
Right.
or just the distance.
So you don't really
This
care
distance would
about,
be the VMG.
you don't really care about the actual speed number on that chart. You gotta compute the BMG.
Yeah, what you care about is this point where it's optimum for downwind and this point where it's optimum for upwind.
Mhm.
So the
Okay.
upwind notch is a huge concave region of the polar, and that's why it's silly to try and sail directly upwind. Instead, you sail to this peak and this peak alternating, and your VMG equals the speed corresponding to this distance.
What's VMG?
Velocity made good. And it's understood to mean velocity made good in the upwind direction. Sometimes for long races, it's applied to velocity made good towards the finish line, but that's more proper to call that VMC, or velocity made good on course. VMG usually means the component of velocity goes in the exact upwind direction or the exact downwind direction. Then the same thing happens down here. It's only slightly concave outward, but it still means that you'll get downwind faster if you go this way and then this way, alternating. In stronger wind, these might go up a little bit, the reaching speeds might be faster, and if the wind is really strong, you might get a polar curve that looks like that. In that case, you might as well just aim straight downwind. There's no VMG advantage to reaching up. This might be a Merritt 25 polar in maybe 20 knots of wind. Actually, I think the reaching speeds would be a little bit bigger than what I've shown. Now, one of the interesting things you can use a set of polar curves for, is to analyze what happens with different sails. With your upwind sails, the polar might look like this, and then as soon as the spinnaker goes up, there's a break point like that. I'll just show half of it to hopefully make it a little less confusing. So your upwind speed is this. Your upwind speed increases a little bit as you bear off, and then as soon as you go low enough to put a spinnaker up, the speed through the water jumps. So that means you actually have another concave region of the polar curve, and there's an opportunity there. Instead of sailing, let's say the mark is in this direction, instead of just sailing in that, well, I didn't quite draw it to do what I wanted to. Let's say the mark, okay, let's say the mark is in this direction. It has to be, it has to be, you see what I'm getting at, it has to be concave in the direction you want to go. So there's a kind of crosswind tacking where you would go this way for a little while, and then this way for a little while. And by alternating between no spinnaker this way and with the spinnaker that way, your VMC, your velocity made good towards the mark, is this instead of this. That hardly ever actually comes up in real life, maybe sometimes in ocean racing. And you wouldn't do it by alternating, you would maybe sail the half the leg without a spinnaker and then the second half of the leg with the spinnaker to take advantage of it. But it's the way to settle those arguments about should we have spinnaker up, well, we'll go lower, but we'll go faster, then we can come up later with the jib only. And the shape of the polar curve actually tells you analytically whether that's a smart thing to do. Something else the polar curve tells you to do is how to handle changing wind speeds. The general rule there is sail high in the lighter winds and sail low in the heavier winds. Because in lighter winds, the polar tends to be more skewed this way with the faster speeds close reaching. In the heavier winds, it's skewed more towards the higher speeds, broad reaching and running. So if you know you're sailing through an area of fluky winds with the wind speeds going up and down, and this is very much applicable to racing at Bahia where there's a reaching leg, go high where the wind is light and then go low in the puffs. That also has the effect of keeping you in the puffs longer because you go with that mass of air and getting you out of the light spots faster because you're going up, you're altering your course in the opposite direction from the way the air's moving.
So when I'm sorry, to repeat this, when the wind is low, you want to be closer to the wind,
Yeah.
and when the wind is high, you want to go more on a close reach as opposed to a close hold.
When the wind's high, then, well, this only applies on a reach, not going upwind or downwind. But let's say wind direction constant, light wind area here, heavy wind area here. The optimal course is usually to come up in the lighter stuff and then lower in the heavier wind. And that's something that follows from the way the polar curve changes shape.
And you're saying this is only on a broad reach?
Any kind of reach. Any kind of reach where you have the discretion to go a little bit higher or a little bit lower.
And in terms of knots, what would you say is light air?
It pretty much applies through all wind speeds. You know, even if you're talking about 35 knots versus 45 knots, because the stronger the wind is, the more important it is to go down with it. You know, or if it's 2 knots versus 4 knots, that rule still applies. High in the lulls and down in the puffs.
But how can I shorten my distance through the light stuff if I take an angle? It looks like the distance is actually longer. In
Because really the light part, you know, there's light and there's heavy. Let's say this is medium. All these regions of wind are actually progressing from upwind to downwind. So when you get in the light part, if you go this way, this region of light wind is going to move away from you faster. And then when you're in the heavy wind, by going down that way, you'll stay in the heavy wind longer. It's also possible that they're not, that, you know, maybe this is a light spot because there's for example, a restaurant and a lot of trees right here. It's still good to come in a little low, be able to sail that hotter, more close reach here, and then down over there. As long as you can do it without getting even closer to the wind obstruction.
What kind of boats are these polars published for, and where can you find them?
Just about all racing keel boats have polar curves either published or made up. And you don't have to have the polar for the exact kind of boat you have, because you know boats of reasonably similar type will have the same shaped polars. We'll add that to my list of something that would be interesting to hand out, along with Mark High's wind field power chart, analyzing bed air, polar curve for typical boat is something I can include. Although that's easy to find anywhere, you don't really need to dig one up for
But
you.
it seems like it's mostly a characteristic of the hull shape, right? I mean, is the bulkhead really a combination of the hull and the
Yeah,
sail?
it's the performance of the whole boat.
Okay.
You know, and there's a different polar for each sail combination. You know, the polar without the spinnaker will look different from the polar with the spinnaker for the whole downwind points of sail.
With the manufacturer's suggested sail?
Yeah.
Okay, the stock sail.
But the manufacturers hardly ever really know what the best sail is. You know, just the sail making technology tends to improve faster than boat designs turn over.
Is there a relationship between close hauled, where you're right, you know, you've got the jib full and you're right on the edge of luffing, versus the polar curve? You know, is it better to be slightly farther off the wind, or does it vary? a lot by
That's what it tells you. Let's see, that's 45 degrees, and that's, I didn't draw that at 45, hold on. If this area is reasonably flat, that means the speed you're doing upwind is the same within this narrow band of angles. And it's good to know how wide that band is for your boat. Most boats with conventional jib leads don't have much to play with there, because the jib is at a certain angle, and the jib only trims properly if it's all the way in. As soon as you let it out just a little bit, then the top twists off and you lose a lot of power and efficiency. So there's really only one jib setting that works, and that dictates what the angle of the wind has to be. So you only have a degree or two of discretion with your upwind course. If you have in-flight controllable jib lead positions, then you can get a little more, and the polar might look a little flatter like that, because you can, when you sail a little further away from the wind, you can move the jib lead forward and keep the jib working efficiently. On my boat, I have the self-tacking jib with the track that goes all the way across, so I can do that very easily. I can just change the angle of the jib without changing its shape, which is very important for certain tactical situations where you might want to go a little low and fast to get out of someone's cover, or pinch it in the anticipation of being able to hold the cover on the next tack. So it's something you need to know about the boat you race. How much can you go higher or lower than your usual optimum close hold angle without losing speed to windward.
Question, Paul? Sometimes the wind is really light, like Sunday mornings, for example. What do you change in your strategy or tactics when there's hardly any wind, but you're gonna race? Is it the same?
Well, the first thing you should do is start smoking.
To see which way it goes?
Yeah, because the smoke is very good. You need to be good at detecting wind direction with the wet finger. This is something you can practice inside. You know, wet your finger and then walk at 2 knots, and you'll feel the windward side get colder. So you can practice it anytime you're indoors and there's no wind, because you can always generate 2 knots of apparent wind coming at you. And it's an important skill to have. And it really is very sensitive. On a bigger boat, sometimes someone who isn't a very good sailor is given the bottle of soap bubbles, and they're told to blow soap bubbles for the whole race.
So one thing is trying to figure out which direction the wind is coming from, which I
Yeah.
agree is hard.
Yeah.
But in terms of the angles to the wind, does anything change? Do you try and sail closer to the wind?
No,
Or
not really. I don't like to make the sails especially full. If the water is flat and the wind is close to zero, there's no need to make the sails extra full. The only reason to make the sails full is if there's a lot of slop. And
by extra full, you mean tighter or looser? I don't understand.
looser, deeper curvatures in the sail,
Oh, got it.
and more twist in the sail. It's really the only time I like to have a lot of twist in the sails is when the wind's light and the boat is rolling a lot.
But you might want to increase camber, for example.
Well, that's what I mean by having the sails full.
So you don't like,
Increasing camber.
you would not do that, is that what you said?
If the water's flat, I would not increase camber. I'm assuming we're sailing upwind.
Right.
What is important is to use gravity to help fill the sails. So artificially heeling the boat over as far as it goes makes the sails fall into their filled shape by gravity, because there isn't enough wind pressure to do it. And it also keeps the helm balance a little bit better. It puts a little more load on the rudder and less on the centerboard when the boat's heeled more. That's a boat speed thing though, which is not really tonight's subject, except to say that if you're sailing fast, your tactics will always look brilliant. So the last thing I wanted to cover was surfing. And to do that, I have to resolve the Froude paradox. Let's say we have a nice big ocean wave. I'm exaggerating the z-axis there. And we have a little rowboat floating there. Actually, I exaggerated too much. That's not going to be look intuitively realistic. Big ocean swell. Little rowboat. Standing up in the rowboat, holding a plumb bob. The question is, will the plumb bob go this way, straight down? Will it go at right angles to the rowboat, or will it go like that because of the acceleration of the wave? Who thinks they know?
The wave's not accelerating, is it?
Well, the wave is, let's say the wave is going this way. It's not a breaking wave.
Good
When I
shots.
was an undergraduate, we had a model tank at school. Great big, 200-foot long tank. There's a wave generator at one end. The professor had a gadget that he called a Froude gauge. It looked like a little bell buoy. It had a scale. This was calibrated. And it had a little plumb bob that hung down. And this was free to swing. He put the Froude gauge in this end of the tank. He started up the wave gauge, and these regular waves started coming down the tank. And he said, if anyone can guess the phase relationship between this plumb bob and the waves going under the Froude gauge, you get an A for the course. And nobody got it right. And we're all naval architecture students. We're supposed to know this stuff. Anybody want to take a guess?
Relative,
Yeah.
relative to the boat? The
That's-
boat is,
You get an A for the course.
is the boat
Right,
moving?
see, like,
We had the waves went under this thing, and this plumb bob stayed exactly on center. We had to reach into the tank and push it to to convince ourselves that it wasn't nailed in place. And the same thing happens on this rowboat. This plumb bob stays straight down relative to the boat. And the little person standing in it stands straight up and doesn't feel any acceleration to one side or the other. And when you think of why, first of all, the boundary condition for a free surface has to be no body forces tangential. All the body forces have to be at right angles. So that's the simple and obscure proof of why that's true. The more intuitive proof, the water in a wave is moving in a circle. The water doesn't move, the wave might be moving at 20 miles an hour. The water in the wave is moving a lot slower in a circular motion like this. The wave's going this way. In the trough, the water's going like this. In the crest, the water's going like this. Halfway up the slope, the water's going up. So at this point on the wave, the water is moving in a circle like that. So the water is subject to centrifugal force going that way. The boat is subject to centrifugal force going that way. Gravity is going down, and the resultant of centrifugal force and gravity always have to end up exactly at right angles to the water surface. Now, given that, how is it possible to surf? If you sit here on a surfboard, nothing will happen, because gravity is always going at right angles to the surface.
Put energy into it.
You've got foils under the water or
But
going at a.
If you can put energy into it, you can put energy into it when you're in flat water, and you should do exactly the same thing. Why do you need the wave at all? Anyway, this is what's called the Froude paradox. And the way to resolve it is to realize that your weight, the surfer's weight, is going straight down. But if the surfer is moving, then the surfer is not subject to this centrifugal force anymore. The surfer's gravity goes straight down because the surfer is not moving in a circular force, in a circular path. The surfer is moving straight along with the wave profile. But the water is subject to that. The water body forces are right angles to the surface, so the buoyancy is equal and opposite. The buoyancy is tipped forward. So to clean up the diagram a little bit, and now I'll show the surfer. I'll show the surfer surfing. The gravity from the surfer goes straight down. The buoyancy from the water goes like this. So there's a net forward component. The important thing for surfing waves in a sailboat is that you won't surf a wave unless you're already moving at some reasonable portion of the wave speed. You don't have to move at the complete wave speed, but you have to be moving forward. If the boat is stationary, a non-breaking wave will just roll right under you and won't do anything. And surfers know this intuitively, even though they generally don't understand the vector diagram here. You have to paddle like crazy to catch a big wave because you have to be moving at some portion of the wave speed. Exception being a breaking wave. Breaking waves are a little different because there's a bunch of water that's already surfing with the wave, and when the breaking part of the wave hits you, it'll accelerate you right up to wave speed, and then you can still surf. But the waves you're likely to surf in a sailboat are not breaking. They're nice round waves, either wind waves or ocean swells or the wake of another sailboat moving about the same speed as you.
Is there a figure for the speed at which you have to be moving relative?
No, it's gradual. If the boat is light and easy to accelerate, then, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% of wave speed might be enough. 50% of wave speed is better. If the boat is heavy and already going close to hull speed, then you might have to be going 70 or 80% of the wave speed in order to catch that wave. Anyway, all this has some practical consequences for surfing waves. Oh wait, there's one more thing about wave propagation. If you have a series of waves like this is the group of waves. The waves in this group are moving at a particular speed. The group of waves is only moving at half this speed. And you all have to convince yourselves of this by throwing a pebble in a duck pond and watching the waves. The waves in front are always moving to the front of the group and dying out. The waves behind are always trailing and growing. At least this last wave will move. Wait, did I get that wrong? The waves in the group the waves are moving faster than the group, right? So the waves behind are always moving to the middle and getting bigger. The big waves in the middle are always moving to the front and dying out. That means that if the waves are going at 15 knots and you're sailing along at 10 knots, you can actually catch a group of waves from behind, and when you get in the group, you'll be accelerated from 10 knots up to 15. You can do this with powerboat wakes all the time. Whenever the skiff goes by, it makes a discrete group of waves. And you can see very clearly that the group of waves is only moving half as fast as each individual wave crest in the group. So let's say the skiff goes by like that, makes waves going both ways. You're sailing along. First you smash through the waves that are coming the opposite direction, and then usually you can catch these waves that are going away from you because they're only moving half as fast as the waves in the group. Everybody believe that? Well, it's easy to demonstrate for yourself, right here in the sailing club. The practical application for catching a wave when you're sailing means that the wave energy will generally come from in front of you. When you're sailing along at something close to hull speed, like take a Merit 25 or the Pearson Commander sailing at maybe 5 or 6 knots downwind, it means that the waves that you're likely to catch are going to be going 8 or 10 knots, something like that, something a little bit faster than your speed. But it means that the group of waves is necessarily going slower than your boat speed. To put some real numbers on it, let's say you're going 6 knots. There are surfable waves going 8 knots, so the group of waves will only be going 4 knots, and that's why we get the old slogan, "Good helmsman never looks back." You might think that slogan means never look back because you'll be scared to death when you see the big wave that's about to hit the boat. Really what that saying means is the wave energy is coming from in front. So if you're looking for a wave that you can surf, you look at the waves in front of the boat, not behind the boat. Because that group of waves, if those are surfable waves, will be going slower than your boat speed. So the technique for catching a wave is to look for a big crest in front, put the bow right behind the biggest wave you see, and if you can hold it there for a little while, usually just a few seconds, that crest that's in front of the bow will shrink, and the other crest, which is just behind the stern, remember these waves are going faster than your hull speed, so the wavelength has to be longer than your boat by a moderate amount. The wave that's behind the boat will start to grow, the wave that's in front of your boat will shrink, you'll feel the boat trim down a little bit as the wave behind the boat grows, and that's when you do your legal, one pump on the spinnaker sheet, one pump on the main traveler to give the boat an extra little kick, and that's when you start surfing down the wave. And that's just about all I have planned. I already did the Kelvin wave train out of sequence. Yes.
Is it best, when you're riding the waves, is it best to go perpendicular to the wave, or is it better to catch them at an angle?
If it's well, there are a couple of considerations. If it's marginal whether you can catch the wave or not, then you have to go perpendicular to come closest to matching the wave speed to get that push. If the wave is not going is only going a little bit faster than you, then you might be able to catch it by sailing on a hotter reach and go faster, the same way surfer carves back and forth. There are also sail trim considerations. You might lose speed by bearing off because it might be more of a dead run. Or especially in situations where the wind angle and the wave direction are a little bit different, then they might be surfable on one jibe and not surfable on the other jibe. Okay, that's all I had planned.
What about maybe if we had some time to work on maybe getting the boat speed, would that be, maybe you can chat about it a little bit? Any pointers on boat speed?
Sure.
From your perspective?
Well, control helm balance with heel. The older books talk about helm balance as if it's something that's built into the boat and raking the mast forward or back. But heel is really the major effect. If you look at a boat, looking at a boat from ahead, there's the center of thrust from the sails is here, just looking at the forward and aft component. When the boat heels, the thrust moves to one side, and that's going to create a huge amount of weather helm. So helm is very sensitive to heel angle. A little more heel. Maybe looking at the boat from above makes more sense. There's a lot of side force. There's also some forward force. When the boat heels more, the forward force goes more to leeward, and that creates a big torque around the hull. So by far the most sensitive, the most important effect on helm balance is heeling. And even helm balance itself is not as important as it used to be with full keel boats, because you have one foil up here and one foil up here, and they both should share the side force load pretty much equally in proportion to their span. So there's a lot of if the center of side force is anywhere between them, it's going to be reasonably efficient. Actually, that brings up a good point about the definition of weather helm. There are at least three ways of talking about weather helm. There's what happens when you let go of the tiller. There's the angle that the tiller has to be held at to keep the boat going straight. And there's the force on the end of the tiller required to keep the boat going straight. Now, which do you think is a more valuable measure of actual weather helm?
Angle.
The force. How many for angle? How many for force? How many for what happens when you let go? I go with angle. Because the force is a big function of how the rudder is designed. This is the stern of a boat. If you have a rudder like this, there's almost no balance area on it. And if this rudder is doing its work, generating some of the side force, then there's going to be a certain amount of force at the end of the tiller. But what if you redesign the same rudder, keep the hydrodynamics exactly the same, but move the rudder stock back to here, and move the tiller back a couple of inches, the rudder will do exactly the same thing at the same angle, but all the force will go away because the rudder's balanced or a little overbalanced the way I drew it. So force on the tiller is not the best measure of weather help. The more accurate measure is what the angle is, because that will tell you what the angle of the rudder is compared to the angle of the keel. And it should be a little bit more than the keel, because the water flowing around the keel is distorted somewhat because the keel is generating lift. So even if the keel and rudder are both acting at exactly the same local angle of attack, the rudder will have a little bit of an angle to it, a little more than the keel.
So you don't want too much angle, but you also don't want to be dead center, because then you're balancing your total wind, your total sail size and trim with that, right? And so is there some rule, any rule of thumb on the angle, or what would be some advice to optimize the angle?
Something like 3 degrees is probably reasonable.
That's what Colgate says.
3 degrees is 2 to 3,
Yeah.
yeah. So if there were no, it's actually a little debatable how much of a downwash effect there is. But this keel is generating lift, so it's kicking the flow that way a little bit. So the rudder angle has to be a little bit more to get the same local angle of attack and equally share the force. Induced drag is proportional to angle of attack squared. So if you have the rudder going straight through the water and twice the angle, well, to make it simple, let's say the keel and rudder are the same size, same area. If you need to divide the force equally between the two. If you have zero side force on the rudder and twice the side force on the keel, you'll have 4 times the induced drag, because the induced drag is proportional to angle of attack squared. And that will be slow compared to the boat that's equally dividing the side force between the keel and rudder.
So why does the drag affect the keel? It sounded like the way you just described it, the drag would affect the keel more than the rudder. If it's divided between the keel and the rudder.
Well, just for the sake of argument, I'm making them both, identical foils. If the rudder is not doing any work generating side force, in other words, the rudder is just free flying or weather vaning, and the keel is taking all the load, then the keel has twice the angle of attack that it would have if the keel and rudder were sharing the load. And that means 4 times the induced drag on the keel.
But if the keel and rudder were sharing the load, wouldn't the angle, wouldn't the drag then be more on the rudder?
Oh, yeah. But the induced drag you end up with is twice, not 4 times, because of course you've eliminated the induced drag on the rudder when the rudder is free flying like that.
There's some other things you can do, in terms of sail size and trim, with a larger, like 130% jib or something like that, help with your angle of your rudder, because you're getting more push off from the bow, from the front, versus having a smaller jib. Something like that helps beyond, just trying to think what else beyond the obvious trimming and then.
Well, the heel angle is really what determines how that load is distributed between the keel or centerboard and the rudder. Mm-hmm. You might be able to play games with centerboard partly up, but you don't want to raise it enough to reduce the span at all, because if the centerboard is like that, it might be, in survival conditions, that might help keep the boat upright, but the span is reduced so much that you're going to dramatically increase the induced drag from the centerboard.
So any sail change would be to moderate the heel angle.
What's that?
So any sail change or trimming would be to moderate if you're experiencing too much weather helm.
Yeah, then straighten the boat up a little bit. Yeah, or maybe a little bit of aft rake on the centerboard, but the heel angle is the big effect.
Where do you come down with the capsize of the open house Mark was talking about? We thought though, just the main sail up was not a good way to go.
I kind of stopped short when I read his post that he needed the jib so that he could maneuver the boat better and bear off.
I didn't
buy
know
that
that
for a second.
but yeah, okay.
That's no excuse for having the jib up in really windy conditions with open house riders. Fortunately, all the open house riders seem to have joined, so Usually the outcome is a lot worse than that when we capsize open house guests.
So I missed the main conclusion. So usually when the wind is really high, I think the advice of the club is to drop the jib.
Yeah.
But this caused this boat into trouble. So was that the right advice or not? To drop the jib?
Yes, sail with the jib rolled up or dropped is definitely the right advice.
Okay, because
The person who posted was saying he felt he needed the jib up because he was having trouble getting the boat to turn downwind without it. But, you know, that could have been fixed easily with centerboard halfway up or, you know, or better control of live ballast. You know, keep the boat more or less upright and keep enough speed on it so the rudder's effective. I mean, lots of things that would be way safer than having too much sail up in those conditions. Anyway, another thing with boat trim.
Paul, can I ask you one question about the
Yeah.
centerboard before you move on?
Sure.
You said the centerboard up is going to induce drag?
It will increase induced drag, because if the centerboard span is less, it takes more angular attack to get the same side force.
What's the theory besides for going downwind, raising the centerboard?
Well, you don't really need to generate much side force going downwind, so you just want to get that surface area out of the way.
So,
And to
having
clarify,
no
what-
centerboard at all downwind
uh,
would be the most advantageous?
dead down, no centerboard at all. As you come up a little bit, just a little bit of centerboard, because the side force that's needed to be resisted is very much less than when you're close haul. So induced drag, what's the best angle to show here? Okay, centerboard. Higher pressure on one side, lower pressure on the other side. The water spills around from high to low. So if you're looking at the boat like that, you get spiraling off the tip of the centerboard. And normally as the water flows into the centerboard, it gets sucked up a little bit like that to the low pressure side and then ejected from the back of the centerboard at an angle like that, and then it curves back this way. When you have this area of water spilling around from high pressure to low, this low pressure is diminished on the low pressure side, the high pressure is diminished on the high pressure side. So instead of the flow going like this and producing pure lift, which only exists in theory, instead the flow goes like this and the lift goes back like that. And that vector there is induced drag. And the longer the span is and the less of this spilling of high pressure to low pressure around the tip, the less induced drag you'll have. And I don't expect all of you to follow that, but just to,
So you're saying if the board is like halfway up, it's
Yeah.
gonna have a lot larger area
yeah,
of
if the board
turbulence.
is like this,
Right.
then the spilling from high pressure to low happens all along that edge. If the board is like this, then it only happens at the tip. So that's why if you're generating side force, this swept back, mostly retracted board is much draggier than the nearly vertical board.
So it means that I want to raise it only if I go on a really run. And as
Yeah.
soon as I go on an angle, I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want
Well, if there's not much side force, then there isn't much induced drag either. Maybe conceptually a simpler way to think of it is just think of the energy lost in this vortex. If the vortex is small, it's not carrying away very much energy. If there's a big area of spinning water left behind the centerboard, it's carrying away more work. So I wanted to make a comment about water plane. This is what the water line might look like. When the boat's going fast, it's good to have a wide stern so that the stern wave can support the boat. When the boat's going very slow, there's advantage to getting the narrow part of the boat in the water and the wide part of the boat out of the water. So in light air, you can gain a huge amount of speed by getting the weight way forward, getting the wide transom out of the water, get the wide part of the boat out, get the narrow part of the boat in, so that there's less skin friction. That's also why getting in and out of the boat when you're the last person out or the first person in is can be hazardous. When you step on the bow, and there's no one in the stern, the bow goes down, the stern comes up, the wide part of the boat that's offering all the static stability comes out of the water, and that's when it's going to capsize the dock. So the workaround is, if one person gets in the boat first successfully, have them go all the way to the stern and stay there, and then everyone else coming on the boat can usually dance around in the foredeck and the boat doesn't roll over. It's when the stern comes out that that the boat gets extra unstable. More questions about speed?
Can you talk about roll tacks and what, when to do a roll tack? Like, I've heard the term, but I don't, and I know in racing, in college racing they use it, but I don't know.
Yeah, and for college racing, they finally got rid of the rule that said you can't come out of a roll tack faster than you went in. Because everybody was coming out of roll tacks faster than they went in. It was impossible to enforce. You just couldn't measure that accurately to prove that someone came out of a roll tack faster than they went in. Okay, so it's
So what is it, and when do you do it?
It evolved from light air sailing. Okay, front view, you're sailing in light air, you have crew down here, boat is artificially heeled. Without the tack, if you suddenly jump to this side, the boat rolls that way, and the sail sweeps through a fairly large area of wind, and it propels the boat forward. But that's illegal. That's called rocking the boat to keep the sails full. But it is legal to combine it with the tack. So you start with the boat artificially heeled one way. As soon as the tack starts, the crew and skipper both jump to the new side and roll the boat into the old windward side. And that keeps the sails full while the boat's turning. So the boat ends up coming out of the tack, heeled the other way, with the sails, let's see, start with the sail full on this side. More than halfway through the tack, the sail is still filled with the old sail, with the old wind direction, but the boat is turned enough, and then the boat is snapped back to upright to pop the sail to the new side. So it's what would otherwise be an illegal maneuver, but combining it with a tack, it's considered okay, because the crew does have to change from one side of the boat to the other side anyway. Maybe I can show it better with a top view.
So you heel the boat which way artificially?
Okay.
To the lower side?
Yeah. Boat sailing along at moderate heel angle.
Mhm.
Command is prepare to roll tack. On the prepare to roll tack, let me draw it like that so you can see the heel angle there. On the prepare to roll tack, the boat is heeled way over like that. So you start with a high angle of artificial heel. As the boat turns, through the tack, the rig is heeled the other way. That's the first snap. So extreme heel one way, extreme heel the other way. The sail is still filled as if it's on port tack, because the boat's been rolling into the wind like that. And then it's not until the boat is just about in the new course when the boat is snapped upright again. And that's when the sail fills on starboard tack.
So do people move over again, or they stay on the?
Well, you end up with the same moderate heel angle you would have started with. So heel moderate, artificial high heel, artificial extreme heel to the other side, and then back to moderate heel. But the two violent maneuvers are going, you gently bring the boat to the artificial high heel. You do an extreme violent maneuver to get the boat artificial heeling all the way the other way, and then another violent maneuver getting the boat back up to upright or moderate heel on that side. So there's a big pump when you do from extreme heel one side to extreme heel the other side. That just pumps the boat through that turn.
So everybody sort of crawls to the low side, you tack suddenly, and everybody jumps to the new low side and then
Yeah.
jumps back up
Yeah.
to the new high side.
Yeah, and the idea is to never let the sail up. It should be filled because of
Right.
the change in heel angle, and then it should pop to the other side as it's brought back up to upright. And when you do it right in light air, the boat comes out going faster than it went in. And that's perfectly legal now for college racing anyway.
Is it legal in Olympic dinghy racing?
I'd have to check. And I don't know if what the interpretations are for regular fleet dinghy racing. If the roll tack is still restricted to coming out no faster than you went in. But one of the reasons they made it legal for college racing is because there's just no way to enforce it. So you're pretty much free to go ahead and try to get your extreme roll tack working. I mean, for one thing, it's really hard to get it to the point where you come out of the tack faster than you go in. It takes a lot of coordination with the skipper and crew. But it's worth working on. Anything else?
Any books you recommend besides Colgate? And you mentioned that book that you from the 30s that.
Yeah, Race Your Boat Right by Arthur Knapp. That's still a good read. And you can probably find it on Amazon for 1 cent. Another one I liked was by Eric Twiname. I forget the name of
Start
it.
to Win. Start to Win.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Eric Twiname is another book I used a lot when I was learning this.
I have that book if anybody wants to borrow and read it.
He was killed in a car crash not only a few years after that book was published, which was a great loss. Then Sailing for Dummies Against All Odds is a very good book. It was written by, what's his name? I'm blanking on the name, but an America's Cup tactician. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you divide the work between the skipper and the crew? Like, what do you want, in your case, in your style, what do you have the crew do for you?
Well, that all
I assume it's a
depends
dinghy race, so it's just the skipper
Yeah.
and...
It depends completely on the crew capabilities. At one extreme, the crew is just a sandbag, and is there to be ballast put in the right place.
Okay.
At the other extreme, the crew is your tactician, and is pointing out wind shifts and recommending when to tack, and really being an extension of your brain. Paul Elstrom was famous for racing his Flying Dutchman. I think he just recently was tied for greatest number of gold medals in sailing. But his first medals, I think, were in the Flying Dutchman class, and he was famous for being out in the trapeze himself instead of having his crew in the trapeze. So he'd be driving, trimming main, sailing from the trapeze, and presumably doing the tactics too, and his crew is just hiking out and trimming jib. And for him, that was a winning configuration.
But is there like an escalating level of thing, like obviously at the very basic level, keep both flat? And then-
Sure, put the weight in the right place.
And then,
If you have a few minutes before each race to do some practice tasks with them so they get the jib trim right, that's useful. On my own boat, the jib is self-tacking, so they don't even have to do that. And I have all the mainsail controls led aft, so once the race starts, basically, I'm driving, I'm doing the mainsail controls. The jib trim is automatic when we tack, and the crew doesn't have to do much of anything until we round the windward mark and the spinnaker has to go up. So it means I have a lot of newbie crew racing with me. Yeah.
About a month or two ago, you gave a presentation about a rules change affecting the windward mark.
You sure that was me?
I guess not.
I don't think so. There are the latest revision of the rules, or maybe not this cycle, but the cycle before, does have some hopefully simplifications about what happens at the windward mark. But as a general policy, I don't like to talk too much about the rules unless I have them in front of me. And it's good advice for everybody. Never mouth off about what the rules say unless you actually have the rule book and can quote from it, because no matter how well you think you know them, there are always some surprises in the actual wording. Okay, everybody ready for the midterm? All right, well, let's let's wrap it up then. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.